Hello again, Summer Theology students. As you're reading today the book of Ephesians, there's two things I wanted to mention to you in that book because sometimes they confuse us. The first is in chapter 1 when Paul is talking about the idea of predestination. He says God predestined some people. And sometimes when we hear that word, we get it confused with another idea. Sometimes we hear that and we think that it means God chose some people to go one way and chose other people to go another way. That is, decided some people would go to heaven, decided other people would go to hell. That's actually an idea called double predestination, and it's not what Paul has in mind here. What Paul means here is not that God is deciding some people will go to heaven and some others will go to hell, but rather what he means is when a person has faith, comes to believe in Jesus, and becomes part of God's family, God did that. That the Holy Spirit makes faith in people, and that God knew ahead of time which people would come to believe in him. So what about the rest of them? What about the ones who don't come to believe in him? Why do some people believe and other people don't? Why would God create people who don't ultimately come to believe in him, who will then go to hell? These are all hidden God questions, like we've talked about, questions that we don't know the answers to. What we do know is this: when someone has faith in Jesus, when they come to believe in God and become part of his family, God gets the credit for that because God did it. When they don't come to believe, when a person doesn't believe in him, that's their fault because they did it. Don't know how that works or why, but that's the way God set the system up. That's what Paul has in mind here in chapter 1. The second thing I want to talk to you about is in chapter 5. It's the idea of submission. When Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands. And sometimes we get the idea, or we hear from others the idea, that this means the Bible is not favorable toward women. It doesn't like women. That Paul is not in favor of women. He has a bad view of them. None of this is true. The important thing to remember when we look at that passage, when we see those words, wives, submit to your husbands, for the husband is the head of the wife, is the end of that sentence, just as Christ is the head of the church. And so the pattern that Paul is setting up here, the example that Paul is setting up here, is that husbands should treat wives just as Christ treats his church. Wives should behave toward husbands just as husbands ought to behave toward Christ. So that's the pattern there. It isn't only about wives and husbands. It's all centered really in what Jesus is and what Jesus does. And so it's actually, when it talks about wives submitting to husbands, that is, wives, allow your husbands to do the proper thing for you. It's a pattern and a responsibility for husbands. So he says husbands should treat their wives just as Christ treated the church. And how was that? He laid down his life for his church. He gave his life, sacrificed even his life for his church in order to present them blameless before God, in order to do the right thing for them. And so that's the expectation that Paul is giving for husbands here. Not that they should be heavy-handed or mistreat their wives, but that they should lay down even their very life, if necessary, to do the right thing for their wife. And so this isn't a negative view toward women. It actually holds women very highly to say that they're worth the life of their husband, if that's what it comes to.